The Alpha King looked into the child's eyes for less than a second before condemning her in front of the entire pack. No trial, no hesitation. Just one word whispered through the crowd like a curse. Wrong. They said the forest would finish what the wolves refused to do, because no child abandoned beyond those trees had ever returned alive. But that night, something changed. The wolves became restless. Growls echoed through the darkness. Shadows moved between the trees without sound. And before dawn, the entire pack realized a terrifying truth no one could explain. The forest had not rejected the child. It had chosen her. Some in the pack would later swear they heard footsteps circling the trees that night, even though nothing was there. Others claimed the wolves bowed their heads the moment the wind changed direction. And the few who witnessed what happened before sunrise never spoke of it the same way twice, because the child they abandoned did not cry. She did not run. She simply stood there, deep in the darkness, as if something ancient had been waiting for her all along. If you've ever felt rejected for being different, you already understand why this story unsettled the entire kingdom. What happened in that forest was more than a broken law between wolves and humans. It was the beginning of something the Alpha King could no longer control, and by the time the pack understood what the forest had truly chosen, it was already too late to turn back. And now, back to the clearing, back to the snow and the silence, and the child who has just been rejected by the most powerful alpha in the land. Because the forest is already moving. There are stories that entertain, and then there are stories that explain something. About the world, about power, about the invisible architecture of belonging that no ceremony, no crown, and no act of public rejection can ever fully destroy. This is one of those stories. And to understand what really happened in that forest, we need to go back, further than the clearing, further than the ceremony, further than the alpha's cold eyes and the child's steady silence. We need to go back to where the fear began. Because the rejection that happened that night didn't start with one man's decision. It started with a prophecy. And prophecies, as anyone who has ever lived inside one will tell you, have a way of shaping reality long before they are fulfilled. The pack had existed for generations in that valley, a community built on hierarchy, on the ancient rules of dominance and submission that had kept them alive through winters that would have broken lesser groups. They knew the land. They knew the wolves. They knew the rhythms of the forest the way you know the layout of a house you've lived in your entire life. Without thinking, without questioning, without ever asking whether the walls themselves might have something to say. They were strong. They were organized. And like all communities built on the certainty of their own power, they were quietly, profoundly afraid of the one thing they couldn't control. The legend was old, older than the current Alpha's bloodline, older than the pack's founding stories, older, some of the elders whispered, than the valley itself. It spoke of a child who would arrive in the pack, not through the normal channels of birth and belonging, but marked, somehow in ways that couldn't always be seen immediately, by the forest. Not by any human authority, not by lineage or strength, or the approval of the Alpha. Marked by something else entirely, something that the pack had learned over centuries of living beside the wilderness to simultaneously revere and fear. The legend called this child the one the trees chose, and depending on who was telling the story, that phrase carried entirely different weight. To the warriors, the ones who built their identity around physical dominance and the clarity of the pack's hierarchy, the prophecy was a threat. A child chosen by the forest, rather than by the Alpha, was a child who answered to a different authority, and in a world organized entirely around the idea that the Alpha's authority was absolute, that was not a gift. That was a destabilization. That was the beginning of an unraveling. They had built everything on the certainty that power flowed from the top down, from the strongest outward, from the king to the pack, and never, never, from the wilderness inward. The idea of something choosing from outside that system was, to them, the definition of chaos. To the elders, however, the ones who carried the oldest memories, who remembered the stories their grandparents had told in low voices around fires that burned through the longest nights, the prophecy was something else, something that required more patience than fear. They spoke of the forest as a living intelligence, not metaphorically, but literally, the way you might speak of a river or a storm, something with direction, with intention, with the capacity to recognize what was needed and to call it forward. In their understanding, the child chosen by the forest wasn't a threat to the pack. She was a correction, a rebalancing, something the natural world had determined was necessary, even if the human world wasn't ready to understand why. The tension between those two interpretations had existed quietly for years, surfacing occasionally in arguments between younger warriors and older advisors, dissolving back into the daily rhythms of pack life whenever a more immediate concern required attention. But when the child appeared, when she arrived in the pack in the way she did, when certain things began to happen around her that couldn't be explained by normal logic, that tension stopped being theoretical. It became immediate. It became urgent. And it became, very quickly, the kind of collective fear that demands a response. Fear is a remarkable force in communities. Not the simple fear of physical danger. That kind of fear is clean, direct, actionable. The fear that had been building in the pack was the other kind, the kind that doesn't have a clear object, the kind that emerges when something unfamiliar appears in a world that has been organized around the familiar, and that thing refuses to behave the way the existing rules say it should. That kind of fear spreads through a community like something in the water, quietly, invisibly, touching everyone in ways they might not even recognize as fear at first. It presents itself as caution, as prudence, as the reasonable judgment that something is wrong and must be addressed. And so by the time the alpha stood in that clearing on that winter night and looked at the child, he wasn't acting alone. He was acting as the instrument of a collective anxiety that had been building for months. He was doing what leaders who are more afraid than they know often do. He was transforming private fear into public action, giving the pack's nameless dread a name, a target, a verdict. He was, in the way that certain kinds of power always work, making the fear visible by focusing it. The announcement came the way alpha announcements always come in communities organized around dominance, with certainty, with the full weight of authority behind every word, with the implicit understanding that questioning the verdict would be understood as an act of disloyalty. The child, he declared, was wrong. She was weak. She was different in the ways that the pack could not accommodate, marked in the ways that made her incompatible with the pack's survival, her presence a risk that the community could not absorb. He used the language of collective protection. He framed the rejection as an act of care for the group. He stood in front of hundreds of people who trusted him, who had built their sense of safety around his judgment, and he gave them permission to be afraid of a child, and permission, more importantly, not to feel guilty about it. And the crowd accepted it. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with because it is the part that feels most recognizable. Not the alpha's cruelty. Cruelty in people who hold power is, unfortunately, something we have all encountered often enough to recognize it quickly. What is harder to absorb is the silence of the crowd. The hundreds of people who stood in that clearing, who saw a child standing alone in the snow, who felt something in their chests that was the beginning of discomfort, the beginning of this isn't right, and who chose, each of them, individually, in their own private moment of decision, to let that feeling pass, to look away, to trust the alpha's certainty over their own intuition, to become, through their silence, participants in what was happening rather than witnesses, who refused to participate. Nobody spoke up, nobody stepped forward, nobody moved to stand beside her. The child stood in the center of the circle and watched all of this happen with eyes that were, by every account from those who were there and later tried to describe it, extraordinarily still. Not the stillness of shock. That is a different quality, recognizable by its blankness. This was a different kind of stillness. The kind that comes not from being overwhelmed, but from being, somehow, already elsewhere in a way that the people around her hadn't yet figured out. The alpha's gaze was cold, deliberate. The kind of cold that is not absence of emotion, but its opposite, a coldness that is carefully maintained because it must be, because to let it thaw even slightly would be to reveal what lies underneath it. He looked at this child with the full, practiced certainty of a man who has never been wrong, who has built his entire identity around the impossibility of being wrong, and whose greatest unspoken fear is exactly that. And the child looked back at him, not with defiance, not with the kind of challenge that would have given him something to work with, some excuse to escalate, some justification for what he was about to do. She looked back at him with something that was, in its own quiet way, far more devastating than defiance. She looked back at him with recognition, as if she already understood something about him that he did not yet understand about himself. As if she could see, clearly and without judgment, exactly what this moment of power was actually made of. Then they took her into the forest. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because what happened next is where the story stops being about rejection and starts being about something else entirely. Something that the pack, in all its certainty and all its fear, had no framework to understand. The forest that the child was left in was not the forest of fairy tales, not the dark, threatening wilderness of stories designed to teach children that the world outside safe boundaries is dangerous and should be feared. This was a real place, a place with its own logic, a place that had been operating according to its own intelligence long before the pack arrived in the valley, and that would continue operating according to that intelligence long after everything the pack had built had crumbled back into the earth. Nobody survived alone in that forest. That was not a superstition or an exaggeration. It was simply the accumulated evidence of every person who had ever been sent there and not come back. The trees grew close enough in certain places to block the light entirely, creating a permanent twilight that disoriented even experienced hunters within hours. The temperature dropped in ways that seemed disconnected from the actual season, pockets of cold so severe they had no meteorological explanation, appearing suddenly in clearings that had been temperate moments before. There were sounds that the pack's best trackers had never been able to attribute to any known animal, low, rhythmic, almost melodic in their pattern, heard most often at the edges of the deepest sections of the forest, never in the same place twice. Children did not survive there. That had been established definitively enough that using the forest as a place of exile was considered by most of the pack's members to be a sentence with only one possible outcome. It was chosen precisely because of that certainty. The alpha needed the child gone, not just removed from the pack's immediate sight, but gone in a way that removed her from the story permanently, that allowed the narrative of threat and resolution to have a clean ending. The storm that night added to what was already a near impossible situation. Snow came in sideways, the kind of snow that doesn't feel like precipitation, but like pressure, as if the sky itself is pushing down on everything beneath it. The child was left at the forest's edge with nothing. No shelter, no food, no fire, no tool of any kind that might allow her to build something between herself and the cold. She was left with exactly what the alpha and the pack believed she had, nothing. And then the people who brought her there turned and walked back toward the lights of the settlement and did not look behind them. For a long time there was nothing in the forest but wind and snow and the particular quality of silence that exists inside a storm, that paradoxical stillness at the center of noise that feels less like quiet and more like the world holding something back. And then the sounds began. Not threatening sounds. Not the crack of branches that signals something large moving through underbrush, not the low warning sounds that prey animals make when a predator is close. These were different. Deeper. Something between sound and vibration, felt as much in the chest as heard by the ears, moving through the storm in patterns that were too regular to be random, too subtle to be obvious, impossible to locate but impossible to ignore. The child turned in the direction that seemed most dense with it, not with fear, witnesses later said, but with the particular attentiveness of someone who has just heard something they were waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. Something in that forest was paying attention. The wolves came first as shadows, shapes moving between the trees at the edges of visibility, appearing and disappearing as the snow shifted and obscured the light. Any other child, any adult, would have experienced this as the confirmation of their worst fear, alone in a forest that kills people, in a storm, in the dark, and now surrounded by wolves. The instinct would have been to run, or to freeze, or to do the complicated, panicked calculus of survival that the mind performs when it determines that the situation has crossed from difficult into genuinely life-threatening. The child did not run. She did not freeze. She stood in the snow, and she watched the shapes between the trees. And the shapes between the trees watched her back, and there was in that mutual observation something that felt, to anyone who later tried to understand it, less like predator and prey and more like recognition. As if both parties in that clearing understood something about the situation that the people back in the settlement did not. The wolves did not attack. Instead, slowly, with a deliberateness that was entirely unlike the behavior of any wolf the pack's hunters had ever observed, they moved toward her, not rushing, not circling in the way wolves circle when they are assessing prey, not communicating through the short, sharp body language of coordinated hunting. Walking, simply walking, in ones and twos and then threes, emerging from the tree line and moving into the clearing where the child stood and arranging themselves around her in a formation that was unmistakably, to anyone willing to see it, protective. The snow continued to fall. But in the space inside the circle of wolves, something changed about the way it fell. The storm continued in full force at the clearing's edges, visible and audible and entirely real, but at its center, where the child stood and the wolves had gathered, the snow seemed to ease, not to stop, but to slow, to lose some of its violence, as if the storm itself had decided that this particular spot was exempt from its full force, or as if something about the gathering in that clearing had changed the conditions around it in ways that no conventional understanding of weather could explain. The largest wolf came last. He was enormous, the kind of animal that makes you recalibrate your understanding of how large wolves can be, that makes every other wolf you've ever seen seem like a preliminary sketch for what a wolf could become if the world decided to try again. He moved through the circle without hurrying, without making any sound despite his size, and he stopped directly in front of the child with a distance of perhaps 2 feet between them, close enough that his breath was visible in the cold air between them, close enough that the child could see the pale, specific color of his eyes. He looked at her for a long time, and then, slowly, with the full weight of his enormous body and with something in the quality of the movement that every person who later heard this story understood immediately, even if they couldn't have, explained why. He lowered his head, not in threat, not in the posture of submission that wolves use with dominant pack members, in something else, in something that had no name in the pack's understanding of animal behavior, but that everyone who heard it described recognized as something they had felt themselves in moments when they encountered something larger and more true than themselves and had to acknowledge it. Back in the settlement, the panic began quietly and built quickly. The calm hunters noticed it first, the ones who went out in the early hours of the morning for the day's first tracking and came back not with information about prey, but with the unsettling report that the wolf signs they had been following for weeks were gone, not reduced, gone. The places where wolf packs had been denning, the routes they had been traveling, the marks they left on the landscape that experienced trackers read the way you read a familiar text. All of it had changed overnight. The wolves had moved, and they had moved, as best as the hunters could determine, in the direction of the deep forest. The direction they had taken the child. It was one of the younger hunters who first said it out loud, and he said it quietly, almost to himself, clearly hoping not to be heard. But in the particular acoustic quality of the settlement's common space that morning, With everyone gathered and the mood already tense with an anxiety nobody had named yet, his voice carried further than he intended. "They went toward the forest," he said. "All of them." Why would they all go toward the forest? Nobody answered immediately, but the question landed in the room and stayed there, the way certain questions do, unanswerable in the moment, but impossible to dismiss, working their way into the background of every subsequent thought, like a frequency that's been introduced into a space and can't be removed. The Alpha said nothing. He stood at the edge of the gathered group with the same deliberate certainty he always carried, and he said nothing. But the hunters who knew him best, the ones who had tracked beside him for years, who had learned to read the small signals that his controlled exterior occasionally allowed through, noticed something. In the set of his jaw. In the particular stillness around his eyes. A quality that was different from his usual stillness, which was the stillness of someone who has processed information and reached a conclusion and is confident in it. This was a different quality. This was the stillness of someone who is working very hard not to show that they have not yet reached a conclusion, not to show that a certainty they built their identity around has begun, quietly but unmistakably, to crack. The elders gathered separately, as they often did in moments of collective disturbance, in the oldest part of the settlement, where the fires were kept burning continuously and the walls were hung with the accumulated objects of the packs, memory, tools and symbols and documents that carried the weight of every decision the community had ever made. And in that space, with the particular gravity of people who have lived long enough to recognize when something truly significant is happening, they said the thing that everyone else in the settlement was carefully not saying. "The forest doesn't take," said the oldest among them. Her voice was low but entirely steady, the voice of someone who has spent a lifetime saying true things in rooms that weren't ready to hear them. "It doesn't take, it chooses. And it has never, in all the years that we have been here, chosen anyone who didn't have something the forest needed." The other elders sat with that. Outside, the wind moved through the settlement with a sound that was almost, but not quite, the sound it always made, as if something in its frequency had shifted slightly, as if the air itself was carrying a different quality of information than it had the day before. "Then what does it need from her?" someone asked. Nobody answered, but the question was already changing something in the room, and in the people sitting in it, working its way under the certainty that the Alpha's decision had provided and loosening it, the way water works its way under a foundation over time and changes what the foundation can support. Meanwhile, in the forest, the child was walking. This is the part that is almost impossible to describe adequately, because what was happening to her was not the kind of thing that translates easily into the language of cause and effect, of observable phenomena and logical conclusions. The forest was responding to her. That is the simplest way to say it, and also the most inadequate. The wolves moved around her like water around a stone, not in opposition, but in accommodation, adapting to her direction and pace, without any visible communication between them, as if they were operating according to some shared understanding of what was needed that required no instruction. The animals came next. Not all at once, not in any dramatic arrival, but gradually, birds first, appearing in the branches above her path and remaining there as she moved, rather than dispersing the way birds normally do when something large walks beneath them. Then smaller ground animals, the ones that typically vanish entirely at the first vibration of approaching footsteps, appearing at the path's edges and watching with the particular bright attentiveness that animals display when they are curious rather than afraid. Then larger ones, deer moving through the trees parallel to her path, close enough to be visible but not close enough to be within normal interaction distance, as if maintaining a respectful proximity rather than avoiding or approaching. Something was happening to the air around her as she moved through the forest. The hunters who eventually tracked her path, days later, trying to reconstruct what had occurred, reported that the snow, on the ground in the way she had walked, was different from the snow around it, not melted, not disturbed in the way footprints disturb snow. Different in a way they couldn't explain with the vocabulary of tracking, as if the crystals themselves had reorganized slightly, as if the ground beneath them had been altered by the passage of something that the normal laws of pressure and temperature didn't fully account for. The wind changed direction when she changed direction. This was documented by multiple independent observers who had no way of coordinating their reports and who described it identically. The wind, which in a storm of that kind normally holds a consistent directional pattern, shifting when she shifted, as if orienting to her rather than to the geography and pressure systems that normally govern such things, as if the storm itself had reorganized its logic around the fact of her movement through it. She was not afraid. This is perhaps the detail that, when people first hear this story, is hardest to accept. Not because it seems impossible, but because most of us have been trained to believe that fear is the appropriate rational response to exactly this kind of situation. To be alone. To have been rejected. To be surrounded by wilderness in a storm with no resources and no allies. Every social and biological instinct says, this is where you are afraid. This is where the fear is appropriate. And yet the child in the forest was not afraid. Not because she was numb or dissociated or in shock, but because something in her was responding to the forest with a quality of recognition that was stronger than fear. As if the wilderness that the pack had spent centuries treating as a threat was, to her, something closer to a home she hadn't known she'd been separated from. She walked for 3 days. 3 days in a forest where experienced hunters with full equipment and warm clothing and knowledge of the terrain could survive for perhaps 1, maybe 2 days, under good conditions. 3 days in the remnants of a storm that continued to rage at the forest's edges, while somehow, in the specific areas where she traveled, the conditions remained survivable. Not comfortable, not warm, but survivable, in ways that had no satisfying meteorological explanation, in ways that the people who later studied the evidence approached with the conflicted expressions of people whose understanding of how the world works is being challenged by something they cannot dismiss. And on the 3rd day, she turned and walked back toward the settlement. The transformation that had occurred in her during those 3 days was visible immediately to everyone who saw her, though exactly what they were seeing, what had changed in her, was something they struggled to articulate. She was the same child. She had the same face, the same slight build, the same quiet quality she had always carried. But she inhabited her own presence differently now. There was a settledness, to her, a kind of groundedness that had nothing to do with certainty or confidence in the way those words are normally used. It was something older and quieter than confidence, something that didn't need to announce itself, something that was simply there, the way old trees are simply there, not asserting their presence, but making it impossible to ignore. She walked out of the forest's edge and into the open ground that separated the trees from the settlement, and behind her, moving with the same quiet, deliberate pace she had established, unhurried, with no aggressive display, with none of the territorial signaling that wolves use when moving into unfamiliar territory, came the wolves. Not a few wolves, not the handful that might occasionally be spotted near the settlement's edges during a hard winter, close enough to register as a presence, but easily managed. The entire pack, all of them, moving in a formation that centered on the child the way a river centers on its deepest channel, naturally, inevitably, as if there were no other configuration that made sense. The first person from the settlement to see her coming stopped walking and stood completely still. Then she turned and called to the people nearest to her, and the calling spread. And within minutes the settlement's population had gathered at the edge of the open ground and was watching something that none of them had been prepared to see, something that none of the frameworks they had been given for, understanding their world, had equipped them to interpret. The Alpha was among them. He had come out with everyone else, because to not come out would have been an act of management, a signal that he knew something required managing, and he was not yet ready to admit that. He stood at the front of the gathered pack where his position required him to stand, and he watched the child walk toward them with 100 wolves behind her, and something happened in him that he had no practice in handling, because it was something he had never, in his entire adult life, experienced. He was uncertain. not doubtful. He had been doubtful before, in tactical situations, in decisions about resources and territory, and the management of conflict. Doubt was manageable. Doubt was still a cousin of confidence. It assumed that confidence was the natural state and was simply temporarily unavailable. What he was experiencing was different. It was the specific, destabilizing sensation of realizing, one, that the world operates according to rules that your understanding of the world had told you don't exist. Of watching something happen that your entire framework of reality had defined as impossible. Of standing in front of a community that trusts your certainty, and feeling the certainty dissolve into something he had no word for because he had never needed a word for it before. The wolves stopped when the child stopped. She stopped at the edge of the open ground, close enough to the settlement, that every face was clearly visible to her, far enough that the weight of what she had brought with her, the pack, the implication, the sheer impossible fact of it, could be fully registered. She stood there in the cold morning light, and she looked at the settlement she had been exiled from 3 days before, and then, as if she had considered all the things a person might do in this moment, and had chosen the most honest among them, she simply stood quietly and let the moment be what it was. The old woman who had spoken in the elders' room, who had said the forest doesn't take, it chooses, was standing near the back of the gathered pack. She was too far away for anyone to see her face clearly, but the people standing near her later said that she showed no surprise. That her expression was the expression of someone watching a prediction confirm itself. Not pleased, not triumphant, but quietly, gravely satisfied. As if the world had done what she had always believed it would do, had always known it must, and there was in that confirmation not joy, but the particular solemnity of being correct about something whose implications were very serious. The Alpha could not speak. This was the detail that would later become the central symbol of everything that changed. Not the wolves, not the impossible survival, not even the child's return. The Alpha's silence, the man who had declared the verdict in front of the entire pack with absolute certainty, who had used his voice as the instrument of collective authority, who had never, in living memory, been unable to produce the right words at the right moment. That man stood in front of his community and could not find a single thing to say. And the crowd, which had been so ready to accept his certainty 3 days ago, which had maintained its collective silence in that ceremony as the expression of its trust in his judgment, now maintained its silence for a different reason. Because they were watching something that was reorganizing itself inside them. Because the frameworks they had been using to understand their world were being quietly but permanently altered by what they were seeing. Because you cannot watch a child walk out of a forest that kills people, surrounded by wolves that have never before behaved this way, looking the way she looked, and then simply return to the understanding of things you had before you saw it. Something had ended, not dramatically. There was no declaration, no confrontation, no moment of explicit defeat. But power, real power, doesn't always end in confrontation. Sometimes it ends in exactly this way, in a moment of visible, irrefutable evidence that the story the powerful person has been telling about themselves, about the world, about what is true and possible and right, does not match what is actually happening. In the gap between that story and that evidence, something collapses, and what collapses cannot be rebuilt with the same materials. The elders moved, through the crowd toward the front. The oldest among them walked to where the child stood and stopped in front of her and regarded her for a long time. Then she did something that no one in the settlement could remember an elder ever doing. She lowered her head. Not in the way the wolf had lowered its head, which was its own kind of thing entirely, but in the human gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, of recognizing in front of everyone that this person in front of her carried something real. It was the moment that formalized what everyone could already feel, that the authority that had governed the pack was no longer where it had been 3 days ago, that the hierarchy the Alpha had represented was not destroyed exactly, but that its legitimacy had been fundamentally altered by what the forest had done, by what the forest had chosen, by what the child had survived and returned from and brought back with her. The wolves, when the elder lowered her head, made a sound, not a howl. Something quieter and more complex. A sound that the hunters present said they had never heard any wolf make before, that seemed to come from deep in the chests of the animals and to carry multiple frequencies simultaneously, that was felt as much as heard. It lasted for a few seconds and then stopped, leaving a silence afterward that felt somehow like an answer. And the child stood in the middle of all of it. The wolves, the elder's gesture, the alpha's silence, the crowds altered, understanding. And she looked at the forest she had come from. Not with longing, not with the expression of someone who has left something behind and wishes they were still there. With something more like acknowledgement, the look of someone who knows where they belong, and knows that belonging is not a place you can lose just because someone tells you that you don't have it. Because this is the truth that the story had been working toward all along. The truth that the alpha's power had been built on, and that his rejection of the child had inadvertently made undeniable. Strength was not what he had said it was. Strength was not the capacity to dominate, to declare, to make others afraid enough to comply. That was a version of strength, certainly. It was the version that worked in the short term, the version that could be maintained as long as nobody looked too closely at what it was actually made of, as long as no alternative appeared that made it visible by contrast. The child had provided that contrast. Not by confronting the alpha's power. She had never confronted him, had never challenged him, had never done anything except stand in the snow and survive something that wasn't supposed to be survivable. But by surviving it, by being chosen by something that the alpha's version of strength could not command, by returning with evidence that the forest, that ancient, indifferent, enormously powerful system that the pack lived beside and feared and had organized their entire existence around managing, had made its own judgment. And its judgment was different from his. Force can maintain authority over the things that are afraid of it. But the forest was not afraid of the alpha. The wolves were not afraid of him. And something in the child, something that his rejection had tried to eliminate and had instead, in the mysterious way that rejection sometimes works, managed to activate, was not afraid of him either. Connection. This was the thing the child had, that he didn't. Not as a concept, not as an ideal, but as a lived, functional, demonstrable capacity. The ability to be in relationship with the world around her in a way that the world recognized and responded to. The trees, the animals, the storm, the wolves. None of these things had responded to her because she had commanded them. They had responded to her because she was in some way that the alpha's framework had no language for, genuinely in relationship with them. She didn't manage the forest. She wasn't apart from it, above it, dominant over it. She was, in whatever way a person can be, with it, and it was with her. Leadership, real leadership, the kind that creates lasting authority rather than temporary compliance, has always been built on exactly this. Not the capacity to make people afraid enough to obey, but the capacity to create genuine connection. To understand what the people, or the community, or the living system around you actually needs, and to align yourself with that need authentically enough that the alignment is visible, not performed, not managed, real. The alpha had built something impressive. He had built a pack that was organized and functional and capable of surviving the practical challenges of their world. But he had built it on the wrong foundation, on the suppression of doubt rather than the genuine resolution of it, on compliance rather than actual trust, on the maintenance of hierarchy as an end in itself rather than as a tool in service of something larger. And hierarchies built on suppression rather than genuine authority have a particular vulnerability. They are held together by the ongoing willingness of everyone in them to not look too closely at the alternative. The moment a genuine alternative appears, visible, undeniable, impossible to dismiss, the structure begins to change. The child was that alternative, not because she had tried to be, not because she had organized around opposition or built a counter-narrative or made any claim at all about what she represented. Simply because she had survived being thrown into the forest, and the forest had chosen to work with her rather than against her, and that choice had made visible, in the clearest possible terms, the difference between the power she carried and the power the Alpha had been defending. Nature, the actual living system of the world, the one that operates according to its own intelligence and cannot be fully managed by any human. Authority has always been the ultimate adjudicator of these questions. Which is perhaps why the story takes place in a world where the boundary between human community and the natural world is still permeable enough for the forest's judgment to be legible. In a world where that boundary has been sealed more tightly, where the natural world has been pushed far enough away that its responses to human choices can be dismissed as irrelevant, in that world, the forest's verdict still comes. But it comes more slowly and is less obvious in its connection to any individual act of rejection. But here, in this valley, in this community, the connection was undeniable. The pack had lived beside the forest long enough and in close enough relationship with it that when the forest made its choice visible, nobody could pretend not to understand what they were seeing. She looked at them from the edge of the open ground. This child who had survived what wasn't supposed to be survived, who had been chosen by what wasn't supposed to choose, who had returned from what wasn't supposed to be returned from. And she looked at all of them, the Alpha, the elders, the warriors, the mothers, the children who had been kept inside during the ceremony, but had been brought out now to see this, the hunters who had tracked the wolves and found nothing, the people who had stood in silence while she was declared wrong and exiled. And she looked at all of them with the same quality of recognition she had, showed the Alpha that first night. Not anger, not triumph, not even entirely forgiveness, though forgiveness was somewhere in it, the complicated, hard-won kind that doesn't require anything from the person being forgiven, but costs the person offering it something real. Understanding. That was the most accurate word. She understood, with a clarity that 3 days in the forest had somehow sharpened and settled rather than confused, what had happened and why. She understood the fear that had produced the Alpha's certainty. She understood the crowd's silence as the expression of a genuine terror about what it would cost them to speak. She understood the pack's profound need for the kind of safety that their hierarchy had been, however imperfectly, providing. And she understood that dismantling that hierarchy without offering something true in its place would simply create a different kind of harm. She was not here to destroy what the pack had built. She was here because the forest had sent her back, and the forest had its reasons, and those reasons were not about vengeance or demonstration or the satisfaction of a verdict confirmed. They were about what came next, about what the community could become if the rebalancing that had begun in that clearing continued into something larger, about what was possible on the other side of this moment if the people in it were willing to be changed by it rather than simply to survive it. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because the truth at the center of this entire story, the revelation that the whole arc has been building toward, is not about a child or a forest or a pack of wolves or a king whose certainty cracked in the cold morning light. Those are the vessels. The truth inside them is something that applies to every community, every hierarchy, every relationship between power and the people or systems it claims to govern. The truth is this: the things we reject because they don't fit our framework for what is acceptable are not neutralized by the rejection. They continue to exist. They continue to develop. They continue to be worked on by the world's deeper intelligence, shaped by it in ways that the rejection itself paradoxically enables. Because what the Alpha's rejection did, what that cold, public, absolute dismissal actually accomplished, was to place the child in the exact conditions under which the forest could reveal what she was capable of. If she had been accepted by the pack, she would have been shaped by the pack's framework. She would have been trained in its understanding of strength, its definition of power, its hierarchical logic. She might have become something excellent within those parameters, but she would not have become what the forest made her. The exile was, in the deepest structural sense of the story, not an obstacle to her becoming. It was the mechanism of it. This is the hidden message inside every story about rejection, the one that is hardest to hear when you are in the middle of being rejected, when the experience is immediate and real and painful, and the framework doing the rejecting feels absolute and final. The rejection is not the end. It is often the beginning of the process by which you are shaped into something the rejecting framework could not have produced. It is the forest waiting. It is the wolves circling. It is the storm that seems like it will kill you, revealing in its intensity what you are actually made of. Sometimes who is rejected by people is chosen by something much larger. That is the sentence the story has been moving toward all along. That is what the alpha's cold eyes, and the crowd's silence, and the impossible 3-day survival, and the wolves, and the elder's lowered head, and the alpha's speechlessness were all carrying in their different ways as their common weight. That sometimes the frameworks that humans build to manage their fear, to maintain their certainty, to create order out of the terrifying openness of what the world could be. Sometimes those frameworks make mistakes. They reject things they should have kept. They exile things that should have been centered. They declare wrong the very things that carry what the community most needs, because what the community most needs is also what most challenges the framework's existing logic. And when that happens, the world has its own correction. Not always as dramatic as this one, not always as legible or as clear, not always with wolves and storms and impossibly surviving children walking back out of the forest into a morning that has changed everything. But always, in some form, with the same essential message. You are not abandoned. You were chosen by something that the people who rejected you couldn't see. And what you have become in the wilderness of your exile is not a consolation prize for what you lost. It is the actual thing, the thing that required exactly this shaping in exactly these conditions at exactly this cost to exist. Drop a comment below and write, "The forest chose me too." If you made it here, to this exact moment, to the end of this story, then I want you to know that wasn't an accident. People don't stay through something like this unless it's touching something real in them. Unless the story is doing what the best stories do, which is not entertain exactly, but clarify. Help you see something you already knew, but hadn't yet found the right words for. So, thank you for being here, genuinely. If this story moved something in you, if the image of that child walking out of the forest, surrounded by wolves, carrying something the alpha could never take from her, landed somewhere inside you that felt personal, drop that in the comments. Just write, "This one was for me." That's enough. That small act of honesty creates something real in this space, and it means more than you might think. And if this kind of content, stories that use mythology and narrative to say true things about human experience, about power and belonging, and what it means to be chosen by something larger than the frameworks that rejected you, if this is the kind of thing you want more of, then subscribe. Not as an obligation, as a choice that reflects what you actually want to spend your attention on. This channel is built for exactly that, for people who are looking for meaning beneath the surface of things, who want their stories to do more than pass the time. Like on this video, if you feel it, leave it. It's a small gesture that quietly tells the world this kind of storytelling deserves to reach more people, and I believe it does. There's a video right beside this one that continues the thread, a different story, a different set of characters, but the same undercurrent. The same question asked from a different angle. Click it and keep going. I'll be there waiting.